Windsor Castle here.
Yeah.
We've got a fire in the private chapel at Windsor Castle.
Your information, is this confirmed as an incident, over?
Windsor Castle.
Fire involving a basement and private apartment.
You're joking. No, sir.
Patrol at Windsor Castle.
Yeah.
Our boats are on the way to the...
Yes, they're on their way. Lots of them. Windsor Castle. Yeah. Windsor Castle.
Yes, over.
We got the calls about 11:30, and we thought it was a drill. And we're proceeding down the relief road, and I turned around to the lads in the back and said, "Tip, we've got to get a drill today, of all days, because we were very busy anyway." Then I looked across to the left and to the castle, and I knew then it wasn't a drill. So I was actually expecting Windsor's fire engine to be there, and to my dismay, there was no other fire engine there. I was on my Todd. My first feelings was, well, we have got a serious fire here, and we've got to get the grips of it, otherwise it's all going to go pear-shaped.
When I first came in here, the two turrets either side of the quarry's entrance were ablaze. But it was just seeing that bit of it all just sort of going away in clouds of smoke.
From the outside of the building, it was just smoke, and you could see the fire through the windows of the building and some flame coming out of the roof. But when you got inside, it was quite spectacular, because the fire was so hot that the heat went straight through the roof. So there was a red glow, and it was white heat. It really was hot in there.
As the fire spread, the battle to save the 900-year-old castle intensified. 7 fire brigades and 250 firefighters fought the blaze, while the world's press gathered to watch.
And looking on the television and seeing all these terrifying flames and smoke coming out of the castle, I felt the first thing I had to do was jump into a car and come up here. And one of the worst things, I think, was coming up the motorway, coming here and seeing this glow and the smoke pouring into the sky. And that, I think, was one of the worst images of all.
Meanwhile, Prince Andrew was amongst those who tried to rescue some of the castle's treasures. While the rooms close to where the fire started had been cleared due to rewiring work, other areas were fully furnished.
Prince Andrew was with us, checking the rooms through the royal apartments to make sure that all the personal belongings were taken, and then he was actually coordinating with the fire brigade via his portable radio to make sure everything was happening in the right order.
The first area was this area, and some of this had already been done by the time I got here because there were people here. And having removed most of the passageway up to, I think it was another 2 rooms that way, including the white drawing room, we stopped at this bit because we then had firemen based up in this section of the castle, stopping it from coming this way. Having cleared that end, it was a matter of then seeing what was going to happen at this end. And of course, at this end, with the fire going in this direction, the danger was that it was going to reach the library, which is at this end of the castle. And so we were stood here, trying to make up one's mind as to which way we were going to go to next. When they took the lead off the roof, the fire then went through it, which evacuated all the smoke out of the Waterloo chamber and the grand reception room. And so we were able to go into the grand reception room and clear that and the Waterloo chamber.
It was quite extraordinary because you could hear the flames in St. George's Hall just beside it. And yet there was the Waterloo chamber, completely impervious to all the pandemonium that was going on around it, like the sort of eye of a storm. Seemed entirely peaceful, and the paintings just sitting there on the wall.
It took, I don't know, 10 or 15 minutes to clear the Waterloo chamber. of all the paintings. And in clearing the paintings, no conservationist today would ever contemplate doing what was happening there. The paintings that were above the balconies of the Waterloo Chamber were removed from their frames, and 2 people held them over the balcony, and there were 2 people at the bottom who then caught them.
We got pictures which, in any other circumstances, we'd have taken about 2 days to get down. We got them all down in something like 20 minutes. But for a few scratches and a couple of small holes or dents, really no damage was done at all.
I then turned to walk out to see the carpet underway with at least 50 or 60 people underneath it, carrying it like a sausage on their shoulders. But unfortunately, the front end had set off before the back end was ready, and there must have been 2 or 3 people who were hanging on to the back end of the carpet, who were just being dragged out along with it. I mean, they were physically lying on the floor, being dragged out, and that was the way it went. The only way to move it from then onwards was to get the army up, who could march in step, and they marched it down to the stables.
And I noticed this little Gurkha sentry stood at the end, still in his guard post, and I thought to myself, well, you know, I've heard all these stories about the Gurkhas, but he was just stood there on duty with the castle burning around him, and he weren't going to move for nobody. My lads worked like Trojans. They were in there risking everything. I mean, they do that anyway at normal fires, but this seemed to be something different. Yeah, 110% all the time. Some of the lads went in over the course of the day 11 times. We were actually looking at another fire head, see if we could attack the fire from another angle, and we found a tunnel, and we could see the fire burning at the end, and there was also some scorch marks on the ceiling above us, but we decided that we weren't in danger, that we could get to the end to see if we could fight the fire from there. Unfortunately, the ceiling chose to collapse at that time, landed on the floor, which we were underneath. And to me, it seemed as if the floor was coming down a couple of feet. It just vibrated down. It was most probably only a couple of inches. But it was an heart-stopping moment for a few seconds.
Within hours, the flames had swept through some of the most historic rooms in the world's oldest occupied castle. Fanned by the wind, it now moved towards the northeast corner, away from the private apartments and where the firemen had built their fire breaks. Her Majesty the Queen had earlier joined the salvage workers, but now, like them, could only stand and watch as Windsor burned.
Yes, over.
Prince Charles, the Prince of Wales, raced from Norfolk to join his family.
It was somewhere where I'd been brought up so much of my childhood. So when I got here, it looked even more of a scene of utter devastation than I would have believed possible. It made the blood run cold,
I was here as it was getting dark, just after it was getting dark, and it's the most extraordinary sensation. There was nothing you could do. You just had to watch it just burn. I mean, it looks like a chimney here, and on the night it just looked like a huge chimney with 60, 70-foot flames coming out of the top. It was horrendous. But it was lighting. It kept it sort of reasonably light, as far as I remember, and that sort of very mystical red, yellow light that you can get from a flame. I mean, it was a very sad moment for me to sit here and watch it burn. There was nothing that we could do. We'd got everything out. It was just a matter of letting it burn.
after 15 hours and 1.5 million gallons of water, the fire was officially said to be extinguished.
It was a smell. There's a smell of wood and steam, because at that stage when the water had been put on the fire, there was steam still rising.
I have a particular passion for St George's Hall, because as a child, I mean, we used to muck around a lot in there and play badminton in there, believe it or not. Under the carpet, there's a badminton, court marked out. And so, I mean, I spent a lot of time there.
The fire had destroyed 1/5 of Windsor Castle. 105 rooms had been damaged. The area around the private chapel devastated. 9 major staterooms, including the great banqueting hall of St George's, were destroyed.
I saw pictures and things long before I got there, but by that time I had a pretty good idea. But the fire was out, so there wasn't any of the drama of seeing things burning or anything like that. You just saw the remains, the sort of devastation which had been caused in the whole of that area. Yeah, I felt that there was going to be a hell of a business trying to put it back again, I think.
With the fire barely out, the attention of the world focused on the cause of the blaze, jumping initially to the wrong conclusion.
Somebody had put 2 and 2 together and made 5. They said that there were restorers at work in the private chapel. Somebody else decided that restorers meant solvents. And somebody else decided that restorers had been at work with solvents and therefore had set fire to the castle. We, as you know, are not allowed to say anything to the press. They hammered on my door. They stayed there all night. They put offers through the letterbox. They were on the telephone all the time. I did feel under siege at that particular moment.
The investigators decided that the blaze had started in the private chapel. Extensive testing proved that a curtain too close to a spotlight used to illuminate the altar had caught fire. Within minutes, the flames had spread through the roof spaces into the adjacent rooms. The area around the old chapel suffered the greatest devastation.
In the old chapel, there was a war memorial to the members of the household who died in the First World War, and then an addition for the Second World War. And on the top of it is a little statuette of St. Michael. And there he was, still standing there, sticking out on the wall, slightly bent, but I mean, he was still there. It was rather touching.
The survival of the statue was truly remarkable. For everywhere else, the real concern was how to make the building safe.
We brought in demolition experts who were lowered into the building and down the towers, because the only safe way in was actually in a bucket from a crane and down into the towers. You couldn't go in from underneath in many instances. And they methodically worked around the whole building, making it safe. Once that had happened, English Heritage put in a team of people who picked their way through the debris, sifted everything into buckets, and everything that was of potential interest when we came to rebuild later was logged, identified, put into a computer program, and put into bread baskets and into store. That meant that if we wanted to put back the major rooms that had been lost, the very fine classical rooms, we actually had the material and we knew exactly where in the rooms it came from.
unless you actually went round the area that had been devastated, people had simply no idea what was involved. I don't know why particularly, but they took one look at this and said, you know, it's not for the state to do anything about it. It was a curious reaction, it seemed to me. I suppose they were horrified at the size of the damage, and didn't want to sort of commit any further government funds to it. The problem with properties that belong to the government or to the state is they're not insured, so there was no insurance in this case, because the government carries its own insurance. And somebody had the idea that if we opened the state apartments in Buckingham Palace and rearranged the entry fees to Windsor, we could probably make enough money to pay for the restoration. So that's roughly what's happened.
Although only open for 10 weeks a year, in the 5 years after the fire, over 2 million visitors have streamed into Buckingham Palace, with over a third of them from overseas.
Hello. 2 adults. Hey, there's £23 then, please. £18, please, sir. Thank you. That's £9 then, please. £8.9 for 12 o'clock.
Money for the restoration of the castle has come from 3 areas. Firstly, the opening of Buckingham Palace. Secondly, the new charges that were introduced for admission to the precincts at Windsor Castle from January 1994. And thirdly, from savings which we found from within the money which the government were already going to give us for the maintenance of the building. So effectively, at the end of the day, the castle's been restored without the taxpayer having to pay any additional money at all.
The total cost of the restoration was estimated at £40 million. Once the budget was set, the team had to be found to manage the project.
Soon after arriving at Windsor, we realised that the biggest problem we were facing was water. The estimates vary between 2 and 3 million gallons were poured into that fire. We realised very early on that water hadn't gone anywhere. That water actually was still stuck within the fabric of the castle. And while it remained there, it was very difficult for us to envisage ever being able to put on ornate finishes back on, gold leaf back on, wall panelling back on, simply because the water would have destroyed it very, very soon after we put it back. We did a lot of research. We had probes inserted all over the building to monitor just where the water was, how fast it was drying out, and it became apparent it wasn't drying out at all. It actually was stuck probably behind layers of plaster, behind layers of paint, behind layers of panelling.
Environmental consultants said it would take 10 years to get the building dry, and that report arrived on our desks within about 3 days of being appointed. And against a backdrop of needing to get on with the building, we had our first little challenge here.
Windsor Castle is not just a state property or a home to the royal family. It's also a scheduled monument, a building of historic importance. As such, any work undertaken must be supervised by a government agency, English Heritage.
The initial perceived wisdom from English Heritage was leave it and let it dry in its own course of time. And the prospect of the royal household sitting there waiting 10 to 15 years for this castle to dry itself out of its own accord was just completely unacceptable. English Heritage, I think, acknowledged that this was a rather difficult problem that they had to help us solve. And what they did allow us was to put in for scheduled monument clearances, to actually strip it back, to take up floors, to take out timbers, to take off panelling, to actually strip the whole castle back to its bare brickwork and bare stonework.
Turned out, once we'd sort of homed into that problem, that the areas most seriously affected by the firefighting water was in the basement rooms, whereas upstairs, the areas that had been open to the sky for a long period of time, they were dry. That meant that we could tackle the building from a sort of top down. We did radar surveys to check whether the fire had damaged any areas of stonework and left sort of serious structural voids behind. We did surveys using rot hounds, which are dogs trained to sniff out areas of dry rot and wet rot, and we found many such areas.
We then were allowed to introduce fairly passive dehumidification regimes and also occasionally heating to allow the building to dry out a little bit quicker. So that was a huge problem that could have been a major, major issue with English heritage had they not, I think, just worked alongside us and the household in realising that it was an issue which they had to give way on.
The decision to allow the castle to be stripped back to the original stone was an important one. One of the consequences was to reveal some of its history.
I had a particular fascination for this castle, being at heart rather an historian, I think. And I love all that feeling of history coming alive through the surroundings and through the associations that this place has, I think, through so many past generations.
The castle was originally built as part of a chain of forts around London by William the Conqueror in the 11th century. But the most recent major building work was undertaken during George IV's reign in the 1820s by the architect Geoffrey Wyatville. Apart from redesigning many rooms, he transformed the external features. What you see today is largely Wyatville's work.
What you actually saw on the surface was 19th century, and this led a lot of people to assume that Windsor was really little more than a 19th century revival castle. Well, the fire, in burning off a large part of these layers, revealed that in fact there was an incredibly complex historical structure underneath Wyatville's outer layers.
This was most apparent in the kitchen area, where a 19th century roof was covering up a much older one.
What had happened to it was that Wyatville had come along and found this perfectly authentic medieval roof, but it hadn't looked medieval enough for him. This is very characteristic of the way the Regency looked at these things. Things had to look right. Appearance mattered more to them in a historic building than authenticity. He didn't think it looked Gothic enough, so he added a great deal of purely decorative softwood ornament. The fire burnt a large part of that off, and it was clear that here was a genuine, very large and rather important medieval timber roof.
The other find in the kitchen area, of course, which is most significant, was the Great Well. We had known, I think many people had known, that there had been a Great Well somewhere in the area of the kitchen court.
When the rubble was cleared, a medieval well reaching down 42 metres, 150 feet, to the level of the River Thames was revealed.
Once all the debris and everything else had been cleared away and the whole thing had been cleaned up and sorted out and the water had been drained and everything else, then obviously the time came to start looking at what had to be done to restore or replace or redesign all the burnt out rooms.
Obviously there was an opportunity here, not just to put back what was, in a sense, the good parts of it, the really interesting parts, but also to improve the whole area. The problem was really to get people to agree what we should do with the main rooms.
The Duke of Edinburgh gathered all the interested parties, such as English Heritage, the Department of National Heritage, as it was then, the Royal Institute of British Architects, and the Fine Arts Commission, and formed the Restoration Committee. He then personally showed them around the fire-damaged area and suggested the work be divided up into blocks. Those rooms which could be put back as they were, while others offered opportunities for new ideas.
I came to the conclusion that St. George's Hall really, the main building ought to remain, but if anybody wanted to design a new ceiling to it, they could. The grand reception room, obviously, if you still had the walls, you really had to put the ceiling back the way it was before. And the rest, anything could have happened, except the red drawing room, which was one of a series of white, green, and reds that were all designed by Wyatt at the same time. I then asked the Prince of Wales to chair a design committee whose task was to select the architects for the different blocks. Giles Downes was chosen to work on the parts of the castle where new ideas and solutions were needed.
there was generation on generation of different architects, different designers. A lot of them using Gothic, and they were each reinterpreting the same basis of Gothic architecture in their own completely unique and distinctive way, which led us to the conclusion that what we should do is carry on that tradition and do our own reinterpretation of Gothic.
I mean, I'm afraid to say that I've never been a great admirer of Wyattville, and I thought that what was done during King George IV's time to Windsor was, in some parts of the castle anyway, disastrous. What was done to St. George's Hall, I thought was awful. I mean, it must have been one of the great large rooms in this country. And the destruction of the Verrio painted ceiling, for instance, I think was an act of unbelievable vandalism. But anyway, they could do things like that in those days. There was nobody going to say, hang on a minute, it's listed and you can't do this, you can't do that. So I felt that St. George's Hall in particular was a really rather dreary space in terms of what Wyattville had done to it.
The point of that was that a lot of people wanted to build a hammer beam roof over St. George's Hall because they didn't like the rather cheap roof or ceiling that Wyatt had put in under the original roof. And we said, well, look, it's going to take years to, well, not years to design, for quite a long time to design, quite a long time to provide all the timber. And in the meantime, this place is going to be open to the elements. So the decision was taken with a certain amount of reluctance to put a modern roof as high as possible and then allow the design of a hammer beam ceiling, in a sense, within it.
Looking at the hall, it wasn't the length that was a problem, it was the proportions. The shape, if you actually look at the cross-section of the hall, was exactly the same as a railway carriage, and it gave you that feel. It wasn't an English king's medieval anything in that sense. The proportions were all wrong. It needed to be made to feel much taller. The previous roof form, outer roof form, had gone back on, so we didn't have much extra height. We had 3 feet. What we could do, however, was to move down the springing points, the corbel stones in the walls, and that gave us enough to put in a whole series of stepped arch trusses.
Well, in St. George's Hall, the distance between walls at one end is about 1.5 feet different at the other end. So of the 14 trusses being made out of green oak, each one is slightly different. Many of the roof timbers that you see there today were growing as trees about 3 years ago. So when the oak is fresh, it's workable. You can create the lovely sort of moulded elements of that ceiling. And then in about 20 years' time, when the oak is seasoned, it'll become as hard as nails. Too hard, in fact, to drive a 6-inch nail into. Here we were trying to reuse the techniques of using green oak, and we had to relearn the method of jointing those oak members so that when the timber dried out and shrank, the joints actually get stronger.
It's a bit like those wooden Chinese puzzles that you take apart, very much like that. And you have to think very clearly and logically about the order and allow for each to have a housing in the next without weakening the whole structure.
A small army of 4,000 craftsmen then moved into the most exclusive building site on Earth. 78 miles of scaffolding and 12,000 delivery vehicles supported over 200 specialist companies who rebuilt and refurnished an area of 110,000 square feet of castle using the best mix of ancient methods and modern techniques.
I think it's the best job in Europe. We use the old methods and modern technology, you see. That's the way we work it. I mean, when they built this place before, they only had candles.
I'm bringing it straight back onto the rock here.
St. George's Hall really is grander And it's also provided the opportunity to put something at the east end of it, so that we've chosen a huge reproduction of a design in St. George's Chapel by Tresillian, which is a rather attractive sort of round shape with a garter around it. But this thing is about 8 foot across, and that'll be right at the end. So that whole room, I think, will look tremendous. Well, it does already, actually.
The ceiling is once again adorned with the coats of arms of all the Knights of the Garter, the oldest order of chivalry in the world, whose patron saint is St. George.
My only quibble is with this bit here. It almost got it off, but not quite. It's better, but they put a sort of terrible, sort of plasticky varnish thing on it, which made it look like plastic. Do you see what I mean? Because it's all wood, but the treatment has made it go like that. If you look at that, you see, it's completely. I don't know, for some reason or other, but you see what I mean? If you get this sort of shine on it. Anyway, it's like a wax. But otherwise, it's absolutely marvelous.
While all this work was taking place at Windsor, in St. James's Palace, London, a team of restorers was using the opportunity to clean and repair the paintings that used to hang in the fire-damaged areas.
What I've made up is a mixture of chalk and gelatin, which is an animal glue. There are losses in the paint going down to the canvas underneath. I'm filling that so that it's completely even with the surface, so that when it comes to retouching, we'll be filling just the area of putty.
The Crimson Drawing Room was part of a set designed by Wyatville for George IV. It was where the Christmas tree always stood when we spent Christmas at Windsor, and where the presents were exchanged. The room was almost entirely destroyed by the fire, but because the other rooms in the set, the white and the green, survived, we thought it ought to be put back as it was.
One of the improvements that had been put in the 60s in the Crimson Drawing Room had been the installation of a very large steel frame which tied together the sides of the bay window. During the fire, that steel beam was heated up to such a degree that it expanded and pushed out the bay window from the structure that it was sort of knitted into. In effect, it debonded itself from the main curtain wall, and it started to move outwards. And from all accounts, people could actually see it moving, and then the next day they saw it moving back. Obviously, it had been very badly affected by the fire. In fact, it was probably the area of external wall that most affected by the fire. We ended up having to dismantle that wall, reuse as much of the surviving stone as we possibly could, but rebuild it. And this time we didn't put back the steel beam that had done the damage in the first place.
Well, so far as the Royal Collection is concerned, in the course of the restoration, particularly of the staterooms, all major decisions concerning the look of the rooms have been referred to the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh for their approval. I think one of the most interesting examples of this would be the material in the Crimson Drawing Room, on the silk on the walls and curtains, because previously that was a large 19th century pattern on the walls, which in fact Queen Mary had installed in the 1920s. And the feeling that we had quite strongly was that a smaller scale pattern would be much more in keeping with the room. And in fact, we were lucky enough to find a small piece of the original silk that had been there in the George IV period. So, with the Queen's approval, we were able to copy that and put that up in the place of the rather over-large pattern that had been there. One of the more demanding areas of the restoration has been looking at the way the decoration of the silk of the curtains has been handled, and really a very great deal of time and attention given to the most minute things which most people going into the room wouldn't even be conscious are there, but it's the sum of these small details that make a room work or not.
Of all the treasures and works of art going back into the castle, only 3 will be missing. This painting of Frederick, Prince of Wales, and his family by George Knapton replaces the one lost in the state dining room of George III by Sir William Beechey. It will hang above an exact copy of the Augustus Pugin sideboard, which was also reduced to ashes. Both painting and sideboard were too big to get out. The third loss was the Father Willis organ built for Queen Victoria, which was part of the private chapel.
The chapel was sometimes chapel and sometimes passageway. You close the doors and open the curtains, and then it became a chapel. And you close the curtains and open the doors, it became a passage. So I had a look at the plans because I thought there might be some possibility of restructuring it so that there would be a dedicated private chapel, which wouldn't be a passage. And it so happened that it fitted in almost exactly with the window above the Aquarius door, with that sort of diagonal door in the corner of the quadrangle. And it just fitted in such a way that you could make an octagon, which was of the rest of what had been the chapel, which was on the central axis of St. George's Hall. So that really suggested to me there was a real opportunity there to make a great improvement in the layout of that area.
So we went for an octagon form. It needed to be lightweight. We couldn't put a heavy stone structure there or anything like that. So we looked at doing a structure in timber, in fact an umbrella in timber, with 8 columns. And we did a little diagram. You could always imagine it being dropped into the hole left by the fire, like something arriving from space or on a helicopter or whatever.
In the octagonal anteroom, some of the forms he wanted to create and the shapes that you see here, it's just not possible to do in natural oak. I mean, you'd have to chop down half the forests of Europe to actually find the shapes in the natural oak that Giles wanted to create. So there, he again, working with oak, he went into a new technique that's called glue laminated. And what you do is you take a series of strips of oak, and because of the new glues that we have these days, you can bend them into shape, glue them, and they will hold. And so it was really fascinating to work with him and actually see the way that his mind began to unravel these wonderful ideas and shapes and forms.
Then, with the whole restoration project scheduled to finish in November 1997, in time for the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh's 50th wedding anniversary, disaster struck. Once again, fire was the cause.
We got a phone call on a Monday morning a few months ago to say there'd been a fire at the factory and 6 of those columns, which were 6 of the 8 columns we needed, had been destroyed.
Now, potentially that could have completely derailed the project because by then we had committed ourselves to finishing by November 97 and everything was moving in that direction with this very careful planning. But clearly if we didn't have our lantern lobby, we'd lost, if you like, the jewel in the crown.
Initially, there's huge panic and frantic energy, but when we actually got up there and resequenced operations, we go up there and talk to the particular craftsmen involved, again, used the Windsor factor to say this is very special. We have a very special occasion coming up in November. And we got their support to build a new shed alongside the shed that had been built down, to salvage what they could and start working double shifts.
With just 6 months to go to the 50th wedding anniversary date, the contractor had completed the work and was able, with a certain amount of pride, to deliver the key element of the new room, the lantern.
They hadn't put the lantern in June. It's rather terrific, isn't it?
This is so clever. This is brilliant.
This is what I'm terribly keen to. Have you been doing this anymore?
This is the coin.
Is that the coin?
It's the coin, is it?
Wonderful.
Would you like to fit
Do you
it?
want to put it in?
You're bringing it in.
Do you want to put it in with the adhesive so it's in and fixed?
Well, I nearly get it wrong, I think so.
So you want to put it?
Trust me, I'll do it.
Well, I'm quite happy to put it. A little bit of glue in the bottom. It literally just drops in the hole.
But does it have to go in a particular? Does it face?
Yes, it does. It faces the 1997 faces St George's Hall, so it's got to go in a certain way.
It's in now.
It's in.
Does that look straight?
It's actually got to the stage of being almost finished, is it? That ceiling. I think it's rather wonderful. But I was rather hoping that at certain times of the day, you know, the light might sort of come in, and I don't know whether you get any shafts of light sometimes. No, I think it's marvelous. But it couldn't be anything other, I think, than contemporary, could it? I mean, it's not just a reproduction. It's not what they love to call a pastiche. And it's unbelievably complicated. I mean, the geometry to get, you know, the balustrade right.
This modern Gothic ceiling is part of the transformation of a space created alongside the lantern lobby into a permanent private chapel.
There are 3 windows, I mean, 1 window, but in 3 sections at the southwest end of the chapel, which we thought might be an idea to put a stained glass window in there that somehow is a memorial to the fire and what happened after it. So we got some designs, but in the end, we suggested that it might show the aftermath of the fire at the bottom, and then a fireman coming in with a hose through one window and a salvage man coming in. And that gave the opportunity to salvage something. So he's carrying out a picture of Wyatt.
There is a completely new wooden spiral staircase leading to a balcony in the chapel, which the choir will use.
Is it safe to go? Yeah. The green man. Ribs come out from his beautifully put together. I do believe it's obviously of enormous importance to restore it. And I think we owe it to the future, if nothing else. And this has been one of the great things about the restoration, I think, is the sheer magnitude of the skills that still exist in this country. And they are wonderful people, and now we have a testament to their skills and their love and dedication. I mean, they're the ones who deserve all the credit, not people like me who just sat, in a committee for a short time.
If you couldn't get off on having been part of this, then you're a sad soul, I'd have thought, because it's just wonderful, isn't it?
I think it'll last. That's all I think. It had to be done, and it was done. I mean, it was burnt down, and people were found to put it back. And that's what it's all about. After all, it belongs to all of us, you know.
We set ourselves initially a target of doing it for within 40 million, and we said we'd hope to get it done, finished by the spring of 1998. And I hope we'll be well within 40 million, 37 million perhaps, somewhere in that area, but well below the budget. And we hope to have it all finished and ready at the time of the Queen's Golden Wedding Anniversary, this 20th November, so ahead of schedule too.
"5 years to the day after the fire ravaged the castle, Her Majesty the Queen unveiled a plaque to commemorate its rebuilding. Windsor Castle was restored.
Thank you all for coming, and I hope you will enjoy seeing Windsor restored. It is amazing what has been achieved in 5 years. To all the 4,000 or so people who have worked at various times here on this project, I can't begin to describe how much it means to us to have Windsor back and looking better than ever before in time for the celebrations for next week. More especially, it is perhaps the best anniversary present we could ever have wished for. Thank you.
An extraordinary night, and you get so close to a project like this when you're working on it for 3 or 4 years that you really find you don't trust your own feelings about it. So although I've been thinking, well, it's okay, it's all right, it's great to hear other people say so.
My part obviously was only very small, and the old fire brigade acted as a big team, if you like. But it's nice to see the whole royal family here now, especially the troubles they've had. They've really done us proud.
It looked good as it was being done, but to go away for a little while, come back and see everything exposed, pictures on the wall, really good.
It's an amazing job, once in a lifetime job.
We've done all this screen.
Who's done that?
And all that, well,
it's been challenging, the pressure has been there. At the end of the day, you can see for the finished results for yourself.
Well, I think to see it as it is now is a credit really to everyone that's worked here since we left, because unfortunately when I did leave it was in quite a bit of a mess.
Well, I have a real affection for the place. It would have been awful not to have restored it as lovingly as possible. Now, I think that with the restoration, more and more people will be able to see what has been done here. Well, I hope they'll feel that it's all been worthwhile.
fantasy drama coming up next in Highlander.
Piper Alpha. The Piper Alpha platform, 120 miles off the coast of Scotland, was engulfed in a giant fireball, the result of a sudden and devastating series of explosions. The 1970s had seen a new generation of giant platforms developed by the oil companies. They tapped oil and gas reservoirs at previously unattainable depths. New technology allowed these huge platforms to be built much further out to sea and in deeper water than ever before. But 50,000 men had to live and work in close proximity